There are mornings when the world wakes up to find that an invisible boundary has just been erased. Not through a formal declaration of war, nor by an international resolution, but with just a few cold, calculated lines from a global superpower. When a sitting president can be seized from his own sovereign territory, the question is no longer where Venezuela is headed, but rather where is the world order slipping toward? In today's video, we're going to unpack the full picture behind that event. Not just oil, not just internal US politics, but a power game that's reshaping Latin America and far beyond. If you're interested in deep geopolitical analysis that cuts through the headlines and gets to the core of power, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters of this story. The night of January 3rd didn't begin with sirens blaring. There were no bright red headlines flashing across the screen like in a World War movie. It arrived more quietly, but its impact was anything but small. While much of the world was still asleep, a short statement from Washington tore through the fragile illusion that international legal order remained intact. The United States admitted to conducting a direct military operation, arresting a sitting president, and removing him from sovereign territory. No UN resolution. No international legal process, no diplomatic language to soften the blow, just action, stark and decisive. In that moment, the world didn't just witness a nation under attack, it witnessed a line being crossed. For decades, international law has existed as a fragile system, often bent, sometimes ignored, but at least preserved as a necessary facade. Powers could exert pressure, topple regimes through indirect means, sanctions, proxy wars, color revolutions. But the open capture of a foreign head of state had always been a red line. On the night of January 3rd, that red line vanished. Immediately, debate erupted. Some called it a counterterrorism operation, an act of self-defense, a necessary strike against a regime accused of dictatorship and illegitimacy. But deeper questions couldn't be avoided. If a superpower can grant itself the right to arrest the leader of any country it deems unacceptable, then what does sovereignty really mean? If international law is only invoked when it benefits the powerful, is it still law, or just a tool of convenience? The most unsettling part wasn't the act itself, but the silence that followed. There was no strong collective response to stop it. No mechanisms were triggered to reverse the precedent. A few concerned statements echoed into the diplomatic void, but quickly faded. That silence turned a single event into a message. The world has entered a new era where things once thought impossible are now merely a matter of timing and target. In that larger picture, Venezuela is not just the victim of a military operation. Venezuela becomes a symbol of a new kind of power play that asks no permission, offers no lengthy justification, and requires no global consensus. It sends a cold message to other nations. If you're weak enough, isolated enough, and entangled in strategic interests bigger than yourself, international law can be brushed aside at any moment. But this is also where a dangerous misunderstanding begins to take root. If we view Venezuela as just an unlucky exception, a regime that went too far, history rarely unfolds by accident. Actions with the power to shake the global order aren't random. They are prepared, calculated, and chosen with precision. The key question isn't why the operation happened on January 3rd, but why the target was Venezuela and not another nation. To understand that tier in history, we must look deeper into Venezuela's place in the global power structure, into the layers of interest that have built up over decades, and into why this nation has seemingly never been allowed to fail or exist on its own terms. Because behind that shocking arrest is not just a political decision made in the moment, but a long-standing logic, one where Venezuela stopped being just a random name on the map a long time ago. Venezuela has never simply been a country struck by misfortune. If you look at a world map, it's not particularly large in size, it doesn't have one of the world's largest populations, and its military might isn't something that strikes fear into global powers. Yet within the structure of global power, Venezuela has always stood at the most sensitive intersections, where strategic interests, resources, ideology, and historical memory layer upon each other like heavy geological strata. And that's precisely what has long stripped this nation of the right to just be normal. Venezuela lies at the northern edge of South America, opening into the Caribbean Sea, a space Washington has for over a century regarded as its own home waters. That's no random geographic detail. From Cuba to Nicaragua to Panama, the entire Caribbean belt has always been viewed by the U.S. through the lens of existential security, not ordinary diplomacy. Within that logic, a country with a long coastline, control over vital maritime routes, and vast natural resources can never be allowed full strategic independence. Venezuela, from early on, was placed on the list of places that must be managed, whether through soft means or hard. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was, in fact, an ideal partner. Oil was extracted, profits flowed outward, elites were tied to foreign corporations, and Washington didn't have to worry about tough questions surrounding sovereignty or autonomy. Everything ran so smoothly, it seemed like the natural state of the country. But that very smoothness planted the seeds for a massive rupture when inequality deepened and when most citizens felt that the nation's resources didn't belong to them at all. It was in that context that Hugo Chavez emerged, not by chance, but as the inevitable product of a society compressed for too long. He didn't just talk about oil, he spoke of dignity, of the right to determine the destiny of a nation long accustomed to living in someone else's shadow. Chavez understood the symbolic power of Venezuela. He transformed oil from a commodity into a political statement, from a source of revenue into a weapon against the old order. For many within the country, it was an awakening. For Washington, it was a red flag. From that moment on, Venezuela was no longer viewed as a normal country, but as a dangerous precedent, not because of its size, but because of the message it sent, that a Latin American country could nationalize its resources, break free from the traditional orbit, say no to corporations, and still survive. If that idea spread, it could unravel an entire ecosystem of interests that had been maintained for decades. Venezuela, therefore, could not be allowed to succeed. But neither could it be permitted to collapse naturally. It had to be held in a state of prolonged instability, enough to serve as a warning, but not enough to trigger uncontrollable ripple effects. When Nicolás Maduro took power, many outside observers believed it was only a matter of time before Venezuela would fall apart on its own. A leader without Chávez's charisma, a fragile economy dependent on oil, a society deeply polarized. But the Maduro government's stubborn survival only made things more frustrating for Washington, because it showed that even under sanctions, isolation, and financial strangulation, Venezuela still hadn't disappeared from the board. And with each passing year, it became more of a symbol, not through military strength, but through political endurance. At this point, the issue isn't about who Maduro is or whether his government is good or bad. In the logic of global power, moral questions often play a supporting role. The core issue is that Venezuela had strayed too far from the permitted orbit. It was no longer a compliant player in the system. It became a space where other powers, China, Russia, Iran, could step in, right in America's own backyard. And in the world of geopolitics, few things are more intolerable than losing control over a place once assumed to be firmly yours. Venezuela, then, was not the random target of a shocking campaign. It was the product of long-term buildup, where layer after layer of decisions, sanctions, and isolation efforts failed to achieve their intended outcome. When the soft tools no longer proved effective, when economic pressure couldn't break political will, the hard options began to surface on the table. Not as a sudden outburst, but as the final resort in a decades-long chain of calculations. But if we stop at ideology or political power alone, the Venezuela story still doesn't fully explain why every boundary was crossed so openly. Because in today's world, no major confrontation revolves around symbols alone. Behind every precedent-setting move lie very concrete, weighty material interests. And in Venezuela's case, those interests aren't found in speeches or slogans, but deep underground, in oil fields, mineral reserves, and supply chains that are reshaping the future of the global economy. And it's precisely here that the picture begins to widen beyond Venezuela's borders. From a story of sovereignty and power, it shifts into a quieter but no less brutal battle, where energy, strategic minerals, and global supply chains have become the true battlefield. To understand why Venezuela carries such value that it simply cannot be ignored, We have to look deeper into what has made this nation both a curse and a target at the same time. Oil, resources, and the global competition playing out just beneath the surface of every political statement. If political power is the surface layer of the Venezuela story, then oil and minerals are its bedrock, the deepest stratum where all real conflicts begin. It's no coincidence that for over a century, Venezuela has been part of every global conversation about energy. Beneath this country's soil lies the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. But the paradox is this: that very wealth has made Venezuela a place that is never allowed peace. In today's global order, natural resources are not just an advantage. They're a curse if the nation that owns them cannot fully control the value chain and the power dynamics surrounding them. For decades, Venezuela's oil operated as part of a Western-led energy ecosystem. International corporations handled the extraction, refining, transportation, and distribution, while the Venezuelan state received just enough of the benefits to maintain political stability, but not enough to break out of its dependent structure. Everything seemed balanced until a fundamental question was raised: who really owns this resource, and who decides its value? When Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry in 2007, it wasn't just an economic move. It was a direct blow to the familiar logic of the global energy market. Nationalization didn't make the oil disappear, but it broke the chains of control. American and allied corporations lost direct access to a strategic supply. And in a world where energy is the backbone of every economy, this wasn't just a financial hit. It rattled strategic confidence, because oil isn't merely fuel. It's a tool of influence, a political lever, a foundation for monetary order and military might. A country that owns oil but doesn't follow the global playbook is always seen as a latent threat. From that moment on, Venezuela began to slide out of its role as a reliable supplier, at least by Washington's definition. Sanctions followed, initially framed around democracy and human rights, but increasingly targeted the oil sector's pressure points: finance, technology, insurance, and transport. Each round of sanctions didn't just cut output, it isolated Venezuela further from the global supply chain. Refineries lacked spare parts, oil tankers went uninsured, transactions were blocked from international payment systems. The oil was still there, but the country's ability to turn it into economic power was being strangled. In that context, Venezuela had no choice but to seek a different path. China didn't show up as a savior, but as a partner with aligned strategic interests. Beijing needed long-term, stable energy sources that weren't tied to vulnerable maritime routes. Caracas needed capital, technology, and a market outside the reach of Western sanctions. Oil for credit deals, infrastructure investments, and non-USD contracts began to emerge. For Venezuela, this was a lifeline. For Washington, it was the sign of a far deeper threat than just a stubborn regime. Because once Venezuelan oil stopped flowing through US-controlled systems, it began to touch the most sensitive nerve in the global order: the central role of the US dollar. Every barrel traded outside the dollar, every energy deal bypassing Western financial networks, became a small crack in the structure of power the US had built over decades. A few cracks might be overlooked, but if they form a pattern, they become a systemic threat. And it's not just oil. Beneath Venezuela also lie gold, coltan, bauxite, and other strategic minerals that are growing ever more vital in the age of high-tech and energy transition. In a world driven by batteries, electric vehicles, AI, and advanced defense systems, these minerals are no longer secondary resources. They're essential lifelines for the future of supply chains. And once again, Venezuela finds itself in a position too important for global powers to ignore. The US-China rivalry of the 21st century isn't just playing out in the South China Sea or semiconductor labs. It's unfolding quietly in mineral mines, in transport corridors, in long-term contracts the public rarely hears about. Whoever controls access to raw inputs gains decisive advantages in high-tech and military production. Within that frame, China's expanding presence in Venezuela is not just a bilateral issue, it's a crucial link in a global supply chain strategy. Washington sees a familiar script, one already playing out in Africa and Central Asia, where China has built influence through investment, credit, and infrastructure. But what makes Venezuela different is location. It's not far-flung, It's squarely in the zone the US has long considered its natural sphere of influence. This makes every move involving Venezuelan oil and minerals carry political weight far beyond their economic value. Within that logic, sanctions are not just about weakening Venezuela's economy, they're about preventing a dangerous precedent that a resource-rich country can break from a Western-led supply chain and still survive. But when economic tools fail to achieve their goal, when Caracas finds alternative routes, the strategic question shifts. It's no longer how do we apply pressure, but how do we regain control? Venezuela, once just an oil-producing nation, has become a battlefield in a global supply chain war. Every barrel of oil, every gold mine, every shipping lane now carries meaning far beyond national borders. And when supply chains are politicized to this degree, security decisions no longer exist apart from economic ones. They merge, driving actions that may seem extreme from the outside but follow a cold internal logic. That logic is what led the world to the moment we witnessed. When energy, minerals, and supply chains are seen as vital interests, principles once thought untouchable, sovereignty, international law, even diplomatic norms, become frighteningly flexible. They are subordinated when they stand in the way of long-term strategic objectives. But to truly understand why Washington was willing to go this far, we have to look even beyond oil and minerals. Because Venezuela is not just a resource, it's a symbol within the Latin American sphere. And when that symbol challenges the old order, it triggers a historical reflex that has existed for over 2 centuries. From a supply chain conflict, the story descends into a deeper layer, where doctrine, memory, and power converge. That's when the shadow of the Monroe Doctrine reappears, not as an old slogan, but as a new compass guiding how the US sees and acts toward the entire Latin American region. When the story moves beyond oil and minerals, it doesn't drift away from Washington. On the contrary, it plunges straight into the deepest layers of American strategic thinking. What's unfolding in Venezuela isn't just a reaction to a defiant government or a resource gone off course. It's the reawakening of a power instinct deeply rooted in US history since the 19th century. The Monroe Doctrine, once thought to be a relic of early imperial ambition, never truly disappeared. It simply lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to return in a new form. When President James Monroe declared that the Americas were no longer open to European intervention, the original message carried a defensive tone. But over time, it morphed into a declaration of control. The US wasn't just trying to keep others out of the Western Hemisphere. It increasingly saw itself as the one who decided who could exist, who was allowed independence, and who needed to be adjusted. By the early 20th century, the Roosevelt corollary added a new layer. The US would now intervene in Latin American nations it deemed poorly governed or a threat to regional stability. The idea of protection became a mechanism of control. Throughout the Cold War, this doctrine operated quietly through coups, proxy wars, and US-friendly regimes. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many believed that era had come to an end. Latin America seemed to be let go, allowed to explore its own political models. But that loosening of grip didn't mean abandonment. It merely reflected a period when Washington believed no rival was strong enough to challenge its influence in the region. The 21st century changed everything. The rise of China, the return of Russia, and the growing alignment of global South nations made the US realize the Western Hemisphere was no longer a default safe zone. When Venezuela opened its doors to Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran, it wasn't just about one government aligning with America's rivals. It signaled that all of Latin America could become a new front in the global power competition. And in that mindset, the Monroe Doctrine is no longer a historical chapter. It becomes a living framework. Under Donald Trump, this logic became far more blunt. No more layers of diplomatic phrasing or carefully veiled long-term strategy. Instead, what might be called a Trump corollary emerged. If a Latin American country strays from the desired orbit, it won't just be sanctioned or isolated, it could become the direct target of hard power. Venezuela became the clearest stage for this message, not to resolve Caracas, but to remind the entire region of the invisible lines that still remain. It's critical to understand Washington isn't afraid of Venezuela's military strength. What alarms it is the possibility of contagion. a country in the backyard that dares to challenge openly, diversify its strategic partnerships, and break from the traditional systems of control. If Venezuela can do that, why not Nicaragua, Cuba, or even larger players like Brazil or Mexico? In the logic of power, the greatest threat isn't a strong enemy, it's a precedent that's persuasive. That's why the heavy-handed action toward Venezuela is as performative as it is strategic. It sends a message. Latin America's freedom to choose has very clear boundaries. You can reform, you can adjust your policies, but only within the permitted framework. When you touch core interests, energy, supply chains, geopolitical influence, the response will no longer be soft. This is the return of colonial thinking, dressed in the modern language of security, stability, and order. Here lies a disturbing paradox. The U.S. doesn't officially talk about recolonizing Latin America. No declarations admit to it. Yet its behavior reflects exactly that mindset. National self-determination is respected until it conflicts with Washington's strategic interests. When that boundary is crossed, the rules of the game shift. And that shift doesn't need to be legitimized. It only needs to be executed quickly and forcefully enough that no one has time to respond. Venezuela became the perfect starting point for this reaffirmation. An isolated nation, economically weakened, yet symbolically powerful. Striking Venezuela means striking at the collective memory of Latin America, a region where past interventions have never truly faded. It revives an old message. The Western Hemisphere remains a top U.S. priority, and any presence of extra-regional powers will be treated as a direct threat. But history rarely stops at one point. Once a precedent is set, it starts to spread. The Monroe Doctrine, once reactivated, doesn't aim at a single country. It reshapes the entire regional structure. What happens to Venezuela forces its neighbors to ask, are we next? And in that uncertainty, internal political balances begin to shift. Foreign policy choices become more cautious, or in some cases, more daring, in search of protection from external powers. That's when the Venezuela story stops being just about Caracas. It becomes the first domino in a potential chain reaction. Nicaragua, with its long-standing opposition to U.S. influence. Cuba, with Cold War memories that never faded. Brazil, a regional power seeking to reclaim its status. Mexico, sitting strategically on America's doorstep. All are now caught in a new zone of instability. When the Monroe Doctrine returns, it doesn't bring stability. It brings the most unsettling question for Latin America. Who will be the next piece to fall? And how will the regional order reshape after the first blow? When Venezuela became the first domino to fall, the key wasn't how hard it fell, but how the table beneath it began to tremble. In geopolitics, almost no action ever stays confined to a single point. Once a precedent is set, it spreads on its own. No announcement needed, no formal warning given. Surrounding nations begin to read the unspoken message, not through diplomatic language, but through their own instinct for survival. And in Latin America, where memories of intervention have never truly faded, that instinct is especially sharp. Nicaragua felt the first tremors most acutely. A small nation with a long history of clashing with Washington, Managua sees Venezuela not just as a political ally or economic partner, but as living proof that defiance is still possible in the region. When Caracas was hit hard, no explanation was needed. The message to Nicaragua was clear. The space for resistance is shrinking fast. This created a double pressure. On one hand, the government tightened internal control to avoid instability. On the other, it was forced to seek new external guarantees, pushing itself even further from the orbit Washington desires. The domino effect here didn't fall in one neat direction. It shook in many, amplifying instability rather than containing it. Cuba, with its Cold War memories still fresh, looked at Venezuela like a mirror reflecting its own past. Havana understood the logic of deterrent action. Having survived decades of sanctions, isolation, and threats, the blow to Caracas wasn't shocking. It was chillingly familiar. For Cuba, the question wasn't whether they would be targeted next, but when the pressure would return with greater force. This drove the island to be even more cautious and even more committed to maintaining strategic ties outside the region. Because in a world where the rules change fast, isolation is a death sentence. But the geopolitical dominoes don't only fall in countries with strained relations with the U.S. Brazil, a regional powerhouse with a large economy and complex political landscape, also began to feel the pressure. For years, Brazil tried to maintain balance, cooperating with Washington while also building strong ties with China, Russia, and the broader global South. Venezuela, in Brasilia's eyes, was once an inconvenient neighbor, but never one to ignore. Now that Caracas had been turned into a precedent, Brazil was forced to ask, is our strategy of walking the tightrope still safe? For Brazil, the risk isn't direct intervention, it's the narrowing of strategic space. Every time the U.S. reasserts its power in Latin America, major regional players must recalibrate. Regional cooperation projects and efforts to build an independent South American voice now face the risk of fragmentation. Striking Venezuela didn't just weaken a country, it weakened the idea that Latin America could shape its own future without implicit permission from outside powers. Mexico is the most unique domino in this chain, not because it's weak, but because its geography and deep integration with the U.S. make every tremor far more sensitive. Mexico is both a strategic economic partner and a nation perpetually balancing sovereignty with dependence. When Venezuela became a cautionary tale, Mexico couldn't look away. The message wasn't a military threat, but a reminder of the limits of autonomy when it comes to critical issues: energy, migration, supply chains, and relations with external powers. What's striking is that each country reacts differently, but all are pulled into the same uncertain orbit. No one knows where the new red lines lie. No one knows what specific move might trigger the next forceful response. That ambiguity is the most effective tool of power. It forces governments to self-censor, to adjust their policies even before being asked. In geopolitics, few things are more powerful than a threat that doesn't need to be spoken. Venezuela, then, becomes the epicenter of a regional shockwave, not because it's strong enough to lead, but because the strike against it was big enough to startle everyone else. Geopolitical dominoes don't crash all at once like in a child's game. They fall slowly, beat by beat, each beat triggering subtle changes in the strategic calculations of every capital nearby. Decisions that once seemed purely technical about trade, investment, or security suddenly carry the weight of survival. And it's here that a deep paradox emerges. The more Washington tightens the space for Latin America, the more it drives countries in the region to look for alternative anchors. Not because they want conflict, but because they need backup plans. When faith in a rules-based order erodes, the most rational move for small and mid-sized countries is to diversify their risks. And in today's world, those alternatives are no longer vague. Across the ocean, powerful players are watching this domino chain closely. China sees an opportunity to expand its economic reach and solidify supply lines. Russia sees a new front from which to challenge US-led order. Iran sees kindred partners, isolated, under pressure, yet ready to break through that isolation. Latin America, once a quiet backyard, is gradually becoming a new global frontline, where each falling domino doesn't just shift the region, but echoes across the world. Venezuela is only the beginning. As the next pieces begin to tip, this is no longer just a Latin American issue. It's part of a broader confrontation, one where the unipolar order is being challenged from multiple directions at once. And to understand why those challenges are becoming more visible, one must look to the players now ready to exploit every opening the domino chain creates. That's when China, Russia, and Iran step into the center, not as outsiders, but as active players in the effort to dismantle an order that has shaped the world for decades. As the domino chain in Latin America begins to tremble, all eyes aren't fixed solely on Washington or the region's capitals. On the other side of the world, centers of power are watching each movement with patience and long-term calculation. China, Russia, and Iran have not entered the Venezuela story as impulsive actors or emotional allies. They see in it a rare opportunity to attempt something that once seemed impossible for decades: to erode the U.S. led unipolar order built after the Cold War, not with a single blow, but through the slow accumulation of fractures. For China, Venezuela isn't an ideological ally in the traditional sense. Beijing doesn't care much about what political model Caracas follows, as long as the relationship serves long-term strategic interests. In China's worldview, power isn't demonstrated through loud declarations, but through the ability to embed itself deeply into economic structures. Venezuela, with its oil, minerals, and vast need for capital, became the perfect puzzle piece in Beijing's expanding global influence. Over the years, China approached Venezuela through long-term contracts, resource-backed loans, and infrastructure projects with few political conditions. For Caracas, it was a lifeline in the face of sanctions and isolation. For Beijing, it was a way to build a supply chain for energy and critical materials outside of Western control. Every barrel of oil shipped, every transaction conducted outside the US-dominated financial system added another brick to the slow weakening of the dollar's central role. China understands it can't replace the old order overnight, but it can make it more fragile, step by step. Russia entered Venezuela with a different logic, one more openly geopolitical. For Moscow, Latin America represents a strategic balancing space, a chance to show that Russia isn't confined to its traditional zones of influence like Eastern Europe or the Middle East. Russia's presence in Venezuela, from energy to military cooperation, wasn't about turning Caracas into a Cold War-style outpost, but about sending a message. The US no longer has exclusive influence in its own backyard. For Russia, Venezuela is also a platform to express a familiar philosophy that the world cannot be stable if one power center decides everything. Every time Moscow helps Caracas bypass sanctions, every time a symbolic warship or aircraft shows up, it's not just assistance. It's a way of saying the unipolar rulebook is no longer silently accepted. Even aware of its limitations, Moscow sees strategic discomfort for Washington as an investment worth making. Iran, in this picture, is a unique actor. It lacks China's economic muscle and Russia's global military reach, but it brings something both understand well: survival under sanctions. For Tehran, Venezuela is more than a partner. It's a mirror. Two isolated nations labeled as outcasts of the international system, finding in each other not just mutual benefit, but strategic empathy. Iran approaches Venezuela with pragmatism: fuel exchanges, technical support, shared know-how on resisting economic pressure. These actions don't immediately shift the global balance, but they send a dangerous signal to the unipolar order. Sanctions are no longer absolute. When sanctioned states learn to support one another, the coercive system loses its deterrent edge. What unites China, Russia, and Iran is not ideology or a unified plan. It's a shared interest in weakening a system they all feel disadvantaged by. Venezuela becomes a testing ground where alternative forms of cooperation outside Western norms are developed and refined. No need for official alliances or declarations of opposition. They steadily expand the gray zone of global order. And that gray zone is what worries Washington most, because a unipolar order doesn't collapse in a dramatic war. It unravels through the gradual erosion of legitimacy and effectiveness. As more countries realize they can survive and even adapt without full dependence on the US-led system, that order begins to crumble from within. In this context, Venezuela is no longer just a country. It's a symbol of orbital escape. But it's important to stress, this challenge to the unipolar system isn't bringing a more stable world just yet. On the contrary, it's ushering in a period of greater uncertainty. As the old rules are questioned and no new ones take their place, the international space becomes riskier for small and medium-sized nations. They now face a difficult choice: cling to a weakening order or risk diversifying their ties in an unpredictable world. In this landscape, China, Russia, and Iran aren't liberators, nor are they simple disruptors. They are actors seizing a historical moment, capitalizing on the fragility exposed by precedent-setting actions. Venezuela is one of the clearest cross-sections of that transition, but it is not the only one, and certainly not the last. As the world watches Venezuela, what's unfolding beneath the surface is a slow but irreversible restructuring. The unipolar order won't vanish overnight, but it is no longer taken for granted. Every deal outside the US dollar, every bypass supply route, every sanction-defying partnership contributes to a more multipolar world, even if that shift comes with more risk and volatility. Venezuela, once sidelined, has become one of the most vivid markers of this transformation. And as China, Russia, and Iran simultaneously probe the boundaries of the current order, they're not just challenging the United States. They're posing a larger question to the world. In the emerging post-unipolar era, who will write the new rules? And how will the nations without power survive when international law becomes a choice rather than an unbreakable principle? When we look back at the Venezuela story, what lingers isn't just the image of a nation under attack, a president arrested, or a chain of geopolitical aftershocks rippling across Latin America and beyond. The more unsettling truth lies elsewhere, quieter, deeper. The moment when international law ceased to be an inviolable foundation and became a flexible option, applied or discarded depending on the balance of power. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a silent slippage, where principles once considered given slowly began to lose their real-world weight. For decades, the world lived with a paradox. International law wasn't perfect, often violated, but it stood as a last line of defense, a norm for smaller and mid-sized nations to cling to. It couldn't prevent every wrong, but it imposed political and moral costs on those who broke it. Venezuela marked the moment when even those costs began to fade. When a precedent this large occurs without reversal or meaningful consequence, the message needs no explanation. From now on, power can replace principle more openly than ever. This doesn't just change how great powers act, it changes how the rest of the world thinks. For smaller nations, Venezuela is no longer a distant case from Latin America. It becomes a chilling lesson about the limits of international protection. When law becomes a choice, the first question is no longer, is this legal, but who's strong enough to do it, and who's too weak to stop it? In such a world, security is no longer tied to justice, but to self-defense and the strength of your alliances. And this is where the greatest unease begins to spread. No country wants to live in a world where every treaty has an asterisk and every principle comes with exceptions for the powerful. But reality is gradually pushing us in that direction. When major powers see that breaking norms leads to no serious fallout, they have little incentive to follow the rules. And when compliance becomes a personal choice, the international order loses the collective meaning it was built upon. In this broader picture, Venezuela is not the end, but a warning. It signals that the world is entering an era where hard power, economic and military, is placed above multilateral mechanisms. Institutions once expected to act as neutral arbiters are now slow, divided, and increasingly ineffective. That vacuum doesn't last long. It is quickly filled with unilateral decisions, ad hoc alliances, and cold calculations of interest. For rising powers or challengers of the old system, this is an opportunity. They don't need to flip the chessboard with a direct confrontation. Just exploit each crack, each precedent, each moment where law is set aside. For the United States, a show of force may bring short-term strategic gain, but the long-term cost is the erosion of trust in the very system it once upheld. And when trust disappears, power must increasingly rely on coercion, a spiral with no clear endpoint. In this new world, smaller nations face harsh choices. They can no longer rely solely on shared principles, but also lack the strength to write their own rules. Flexibility becomes a survival skill, but too much flexibility can be seen as weakness. Diversifying alliances is essential, but doing so in a climate of mistrust carries more risk than ever. Venezuela is a reminder that no path is truly safe, only a matter of differing degrees of risk. The saddest reality is that in a world where law becomes optional, the first to suffer are rarely those making the decisions. It's the people, the economy, the future of entire societies. Sanctions, interventions, and power reshuffles are always justified with grand strategic aims, but their impacts are concrete, everyday, and deeply human. Venezuela hasn't just lost political stability. It has lost years of development, social trust, and opportunities for its younger generation. And that brings us to the final unavoidable question, not just for Venezuela, but for the world. If international law is no longer a principle, what will replace it to prevent global descent into disorder? Can a new multipolar order build fairer norms, or will it simply become a contest of competing power centers, each imposing its own rules within its sphere? The answer isn't clear, and may not be for some time. What is certain is that we are living through a dangerous transition. What happened in Venezuela is a reminder that history hasn't ended, and order is never permanent. It holds only as long as enough players believe that abiding by it brings more benefit than breaking it. When that balance tips, law becomes optional, and the world moves into an era where force speaks louder than reason. The story of Venezuela, then, doesn't end with a verdict or a closed conclusion. It opens up a much-needed conversation about the future of global order, about the role of international law, and about the responsibility each nation bears in preventing dangerous precedents from becoming the new norm. Every viewer, every citizen, every country has a stake in this, because in a world where the rules are fragile, no one truly stands outside the game. So, what do you think about this historic moment and the consequences it could have for the global future? Can the world rebuild a common foundation rooted in law, or must we now learn to live in an order where power decides everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you want to keep following deep analyses on the power struggles shaping today's world, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.